Thought we'd get started here. So again, this is updates for the three HMGP funding opportunities which are currently out there. This is DR 4480, otherwise known as COVID, DR 4615, otherwise known as IDA, and DR 4625, otherwise known as FRED. Next slide, please. Before I do a quick briefing on who's here, just some housekeeping, guys. If you could keep yourself on mute. If you're going to talk or if you have a question, you can use put your hand up function. Also type questions into the chat. Once I get through the introductions here, I'll actually be answering the chat. So we'll try to keep it organized. There should be plenty of time for questions during and after the webinar. So again, thanks for joining today. I'm joined today by Mimi Weber, who is the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for DR 4480 and Project Manager under Special Projects. Marlene White here is the Chief of Hazard Mitigation Programs for the State of New York and the State Hazard Mitigation Officer for the other DRs. My name is Thad Lugamores. I am a Hazard Mitigation Program Lead here working with the state on these grant applications. And Brian Eberhardt, who introduced himself earlier, is the project development lead who has been working, his team's been working with all of the various municipalities and applicants to help them flush out their projects. So next slide, please. So the agenda for today, part one, we're going to go through just navigating the disasters that we have here currently open in New York. And then we're going to get into the process of completing an application, where to start, the plan requirements, problem statement, scope of work. This SVI, which is a big component of the priorities of this grant, followed in by more nuts and bolts parts of the application, including project location, time, and budget. Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide, please. So navigating our grants that we have open here in New York. So here you can see a summary of these. I think the big news for everybody on the call is that all three of the grants now have the same deadline, which is basically received by us here at DISHIS by June, anytime on June 1st, 2022. Can also be mailed through more traditional means, whether it be the post office or FedEx or other, provided you have proof that it was sent by the deadline. Just to go through the numbers real quick, you could see the total authorized funding. Federal share for these grants is $315 million, $43.1 million, and $4.3 million. The eligibility for these is similar for the first two in that it's statewide, Indian and tribal governments, certain not-for-profits. In the case of COVID, which is the top one, it's statewide. There is no preference for geography. In the case of IDA 4615, it is statewide, but there will be priority given to declared counties. And for FRED, which is a smaller disaster, that one is for those declared counties only. As far as the what is eligible under these grants, you can see in the list of activities. The main point that I want to point out is that under FRED, there is no money for planning and planning related activity. So if you're planning to submit an application for a plan update, that's a hazard mitigation plan update or enhancement or other planning related activity, that must be submitted under COVID and or IDA. Right now you can see that at the top we have the COVID still listed at the 75% federal share, and that mainly is because it takes a while for paperwork to catch up with the process. So we have all indications that the paperwork between FEMA and the state is nearly completed, which would bring that federal cost share on that disaster up to the 90/10 as well. Just was not ready in time for publishing now, but rest assured that everyone anticipates it will go to 90/10 here shortly. And as I stated earlier, the the deadline now is June 1st across the board. Next slide, please. Key dates and deadlines. Again, the application due date for 4615 is June 1st to the traditional hazard mitigation at dishes.newyork.gov. For 4480, it's slightly different. It's that Hmgp 4480 email address. And for Fred, it is the traditional hazard mitigation at dishes.gov email address. So at this point, you know, you can apply to all three. We encourage that. We just need to receive the email at those two different locations with an indication of what you're applying for. So it's, you know, New York State procurement laws dictate that we have a place to receive, you know, those apps that are distinctly for those different grants at those locations. I apologize for any inconvenience of having to submit twice, but we encourage you to submit to all three funding sources. If you are a Fred County, of course, you have the option of applying to the Fred funding source. If you're a non-Fred County, then you would apply to 4615 and 4480. Next slide, please. So eligible sub-applicants in Hmgp include local governments, counties, cities, towns, villages, and districts. Indian tribal governments can apply directly to FEMA or through the state, and certain eligible private not-for-profits. Next slide, please. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funding announcement for 4615. Which is IDA. Here is the basically the official notice for you. There's where you submit your applications to with the deadline, the funding breakdown for projects versus planning, the counties that were affected and therefore our priorities. Next slide, please. $44.80 is the big one. This is COVID. This one is to be submitted to that Hmgp 4480 email address by the 6/1 date. Federal funds available for projects, $293 million, for planning, $22 million. Again, priorities are similar to what it is for the rest of them, minus any geographic preferences. This is statewide. Next slide, please. And finally, our smaller one. Oh, if you could go back one slide. Thank you. Finally, our smaller one. This one is the Fred affected counties. You can see the counties listed there. Again, no planning for this one. It's strictly for projects, and this one is limited to applicants within those affected counties. Next slide, please. This is
Marlene wanted to say something, so I think she'll be joining us briefly. Marlene, can you hear us, or can you speak?
No, I just need to make sure that I was unmuted in case I needed to speak. Thank you.
No problem. Great.
And here on this slide, it's just sort of the authority behind our 404 Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, Hmgp grant. You know, this slide deck will be available for you as a reference with the link to the exact HMA guidance. But if you ever need to just find it, you just can Google FEMA HMA guidance or HMA 2015 guidance. You'll find it. And that is, you know, the sort of longhand version of the manual, the Bible as we call it. Next slide, please. All right. Well, with that, I am going to turn it over to Brian for the remainder of the webinar and shift over to the Q&A. Go ahead, Brian.
Hi, all. Thanks, Thad, for that introduction. Just wanted to make a quick pitch. We do have a webinar on Thursday about the benefit cost analysis for those we've been speaking with or those that are unfamiliar with this. The important thing about benefit cost analysis is making sure your projects are cost effective. We have done a couple of webinars already on this, but it remains one of the more challenging aspects of applying for this grant. And so we're just doing another round there for people to kind of hear this information again and to have an opportunity to ask questions and engage specifically on the benefit cost analysis. So it is a critical part of the application process, which is what we're going to talk about next. I just want to make a pitch for that before I moved on. Let us know if you have any questions on that. Next slide. All right, so we're now going to talk about basically the application process and the steps that are there. So this might be familiar to some. It's a little bit of a truncated version from a prior webinar we did on the how to apply. This is kind of the high level, the priority items within it. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide covers the types of things that you can do and apply for within the Hmgp or the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. I would say on my outreach team, we've had a lot of discussions about generators for critical facilities, had some great projects related to kind of non-localized flood risk and working on stream bank restoration type projects. There's also been some discussion, of course, on elevating homes and floodways or along the shore. So lots of good discussions have been happening about this. If you're ever wondering if something you have qualifies, we have a team set up to kind of help review that and work with you on developing your projects. Next slide. All right, so a few best practices. Basically, the first thing to be aware of is that the NOFO sets the priorities, kind of went over the priorities for each of the different funding sources. So that is basically the guiding document for each individual funding pot. Within that, it's very important that you help us by defining clearly your scope of work, stating and identifying the problem that we're trying to mitigate, creating a narrative that's clear and ties back to how you're mitigating that problem and what outcomes you anticipate will come out of that action taken. It's important for your budget and your timeline and your scope all to have alignment across them. And the more details, the better. Sometimes we get really large numbers without a lot of backing information. So it's very helpful to have good details and good backing up documents and kind of definitions of where you got your costs. Wanted to also highlight within the budget that having pre-award costs is an option for communities. It's not required, but it is a way to be able to maybe recapture some of your costs if you're awarded for the application process, as well as being able to potentially get started on some engineering or pre-work that's non-shovel ready work to be able to keep your project moving faster if awarded. The important thing to remind folks on that is to not begin the construction, not kind of dive into the actual breaking of ground, if you will, without having an award. It will make you ineligible, which we do not want. So the next thing is providing very relevant documentation that helps us to picture and or capture your background of your justification for your work. So having maps and casing, having studies that help kind of describe the situation in more detail, very helpful for our team during our review to be able to provide you the best input and ask the right questions. And having data that is understandable, clear, especially to someone who maybe isn't familiar to your project on the day-to-day, helping us to kind of get into your eyes and be able to picture and work through and understand exactly quickly where your sources, your data are coming from and what you hope us to understand. Next slide. Okay, so first things first, we have a home page on the hazard mitigation arm of DSHS, or the Division of Homeland Security Emergency Services, and it talks about the current funding opportunities. You can start there. It will take you to all three of the funding sources. They are labeled there, and the numbers or the numbers we get from FEMA when the disaster is declared. Next slide. So once you click on that, each of them has pretty similar sections on the website. They are slightly different, but for the most part have similar content. We do have probably a few more documents on the DR 4480 that we've been creating that it might be relevant to other things. So, but for the most part, it's the same applications, it's the same requirements across all of them. And as Thad mentioned earlier, really the only difference is making sure you submit them to the different emails and call out which of these funding sources you're applying for. Next slide. Okay, once you click on them and you're kind of diving into the sections, this is a bit more about where the forms are and what you have to do to apply to any particular project. So there are nuances depending on the type of project you're doing. The most complex are often the acquisition or a buyout project or the elevation of homes. Those have kind of their own additional documents, but for the most part, if you're doing a planning application, you would fill out the documents that are below planning application, and then you would go over to standard forms on the right side there where it says certification, lobbying, etc., and you'll do those documents. If it's a project application, I'll navigate this a little bit because I've found some good questions that come through about it. If you're doing a project, you're not doing an advanced assistance as well. It's one or the other, so those are there as options. The next part on there, the construction budget, Form 2015 management costs versus without management costs. That is also, you do one or the other. So if you're requesting management costs, which are those costs that you incur to actually manage the grant itself, do reporting, accounting, that type of thing, that is going to be something you would then submit and say, we would like to have, the 5% or up to the 5% available to us on top of the project cost. If you're not requesting that, you would do the next form, which is that construction budget Form 2015. And then you'll have to do the construction assurances document. So I won't go through every single one on here, but there is some nuance there, and some of these are either or. I know we had some confusion or questions that come up about that. So next slide. I guess I'll mention briefly on that last slide that there was also a set of standard forms and guidance documents that our team has put out. A lot of those things are the kind of the common questions or issues that we come up across, and we're constantly adding to those, and are in our weekly email blast where this was promoted, or kind of sharing whenever we add something new. So once the slide deck for this one is, for example, ready and the webinar recording is ready, they will go posted there, kind of below the standard forms and guidance area. Next section here we're diving into is part 3. Talking about the hazard mitigation plan and how important that is and how that incorporates into the application process. Discussing briefly the problem statement that you'll develop and the scope of work that aligns for how to mitigate that problem. Next slide. All right, so this when you're entering into the application document, I believe this is the same type of information you would have on both the planning or the project or advanced assistance, is talking about your relationship to the hazard mitigation plan. So if you're applying and you are a county, a community, or a village, you do have to have an approved plan, and you would indicate that here. If you're actively updating your plan, it doesn't necessarily preclude you from applying, but you'd want to explain that in your application to say where you're at and what your status is, and if it's expired, are you working to address that at the county level and your communities being a part of that. So there's room there. If not enough room, or there's maybe something missing that you wanted to explain, feel free to add information to this to explain your situation, and we will review that and do our best to guide and navigate next steps on that. This has come up a couple times in our outreach calls with people. I wanted to share, if you're a private not-for-profit, you are not required to have a hazard mitigation plan, but we strongly encourage you to participate and discuss with your counties and with your communities, making sure that your assets are listed as critical facilities or acknowledged as important within the plans, and that you're in coordination with your communities about it as much as possible. Let's see here. I think the important thing on this at the bottom of the slide that we wanted to share is that, again, if you don't have your hazard mitigation plan approved by the time you apply, it doesn't preclude you from applying. It's important, though, that you have it in place if you're required to have it at the time of obligation and project approval. We're thinking this will probably be approximately in the spring of 2023 when the actual approval will happen. So that's not a solid number that we can definitely say will happen, but that's kind of what we're really telling people. So that's kind of what you'd be aiming for with your deadline to have your plans in place. Next slide. Great. And so the next thing is the application problem statement. This is standard on kind of all of these Hmgp applications, basically explaining, what's the situation that exists right now or is projected to exist in the future, maybe with climate change conditions. You'll describe, what's going on the ground, how often things are happening. So let's say if it's a flood, it's happening every 3 years, or we have it happen twice in the last 10, and basically what type of damages are occurring and at what location. What's causing the hazard? Is it a dam upstream that doesn't have enough capacity? Is it downpours and kind of cloudbursts? And then, kind of maybe how much of an impact happened in individual events. So it'd be great to have the details of like the dates, the type of event that occurred. Was it a hurricane? Was it just a really heavy rainstorm that came through? And what type of magnitude that event was. It's ideally, if you have it, to say this would be considered like a 5-year event or a 20-year event. But if you don't have that information, we can work with you on that. Next slide. And just on that last slide, doesn't have to be super detailed. It's kind of just helping us frame what are we trying to do, and what are we trying to mitigate and address through this project. Once you can get into more detail here with the scope of work. We want to know, what it is that you're doing and how that's an eligible activity, with the guidance, and how will it be accomplished, and basically what are the outcomes that you anticipate as well of doing that. That's going to be kind of the next step here, but basically what are the steps you're going to take and what's it addressing. You need to make sure you tie that back to funding, and make sure that each of those categories of work that you're submitting have a funding and a timeline that match it. At the beginning of it, you'll have an introductory statement just kind of briefly describing what will be accomplished, and then we'll ask you to go into more details on the outcomes, key milestones, and the overall schedule of what you're looking for with your scope of work. I mentioned it earlier, but I'll say it again. The really important thing is for our team is that the scope, the timeline, the budget, and the BCA all have the same information and they're consistent to each other. And sometimes is a hurdle that causes people trouble down the road, and we want to avoid that. So I would encourage a little QA QC if you can before submitting, just to make sure all those things are in alignment. Next slide. Great. So I wanted to highlight some of the things that are different on the planning scope of work versus if you're working in the project application scope of work. There are 3 different activities that are available within the scope of work for planning. I'm a little less familiar with these than perhaps Marlene, who's on the line. So Marlene, if you have anything you want to add to it, I would appreciate it. But briefly, there are 3 different types of planning things you can do. I guess there's 4. You can create a new plan. If let's say it's expired, and this has to be at the county level, at least for getting funding here. You can update your existing plan. You can do a plan enhancement, which would be things that maybe aren't required for your hazard mitigation plan, but would increase your level of resilience and make your planning efforts stronger and kind of fill in any gaps for maybe risk assessments, etc. And then there's also planning enhancements. Planning related activities, and that is the more kind of open, and there's more room for interpretation there, but things that will help you with planning, activities that sort of maybe a more deeper dive into aspects that aren't just about your hazard mitigation plan. Marlene, do you want to add anything to that?
No,
I know this is okay, sounds good. Next slide. All right, so the project scope of work, in this, there's a section that talks about the type of activity that you're doing. So, we have some standard ones here being, as I mentioned earlier, like elevating a home, a generator, soil stabilization. So if you have an activity that's on your project, you might have more than one actually. So like here, for example, there's soil stabilization and infrastructure protection. So you can define those things, but if it's other, make sure it's something that you can tie back and justify as an activity that's approved. The next category is hazards, and you may have more than one hazard that you're addressing. Perhaps you're addressing a power outage, but also within the same project, you're also elevating some utilities for a pump station, for example, out of the flood. So you'd be addressing both power outages and flooding in the same project. So if there are more than one, please note those and make sure those are clear. Next slide. All right, so there's another category here that you'll fill out. Community lifelines are those things that help our society to function and to be resilient. They're like electricity, law enforcement, food sources, hazmat. There's a long list, and this isn't necessarily everything. But basically, what are the things that your project is helping to protect or enable or mitigate or make more resilient related to community lifelines? That's what we're looking here for. So if you have a soil bank stabilization, for example, for a firehouse, you'd be helping work on protecting that firehouse, which you'd want to add that as your primary lifeline. Maybe there's a roadway nearby that's also would be protected by that ramp stabilization. You can make that a sub lifeline, which would be sort of that highway roadway. Don't have to add more than there is, but if there are more than one thing, that certainly helps to paint the picture of what would be disrupted if this action or issue is not mitigated. Next slide. Great. So within projects, there's a category called phase projects. I believe it's on page 110 of the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guide, which I think is included a couple times throughout this presentation. Phase projects are for those projects that are in, maybe not shovel ready, and you're not necessarily going to be moving to construction right when the project is awarded, but you have an idea of what your costs will be for construction, but you need to complete the rest of your design and engineer. Maybe you're at the 30% mark, for example, but you're not quite at the 100. You want to get there before, and then once phase one is complete, there will be a second round of benefit cost analysis to verify that your project is still cost effective, even with the scope of work that will need to be adjusted at the final stage there. So this is a great option for communities that, are part of the way there, but maybe not ready to go to construction. What's great about it is that it holds that funding for you if it's approved. It holds that funding for the construction until you get to that phase. So unlike advanced assistance, which we're not talking about in great detail here, where you'd have to apply again for a future grant, this is actually holding that money for you for the future. And so you can verify after the phase that it is cost effective, that it's a good mitigation project and it qualifies. Great option for those that aren't quite there to do shovel ready work. Next slide. Next slide whenever you're ready. Oh, you got it. Sorry. Thank you. I think you moved forward and my eyes didn't catch it. Could you go back one? I apologize, Alicia. All right, so project details. This is like after the mentioning of the phase project or not, you're going to add some additional details to explain the community that you're that's benefiting from this project or impacted by the existing issue. You'll add additional details about the activity that you're doing, and you're going to talk a bit about who's responsible and who's doing the work and how long this work or this mitigation is going to last. An important component of that is think about maintenance. So if this investment happens, like what maintenance is going to be required to be able to maintain that level of protection going forward? Without factoring that in, the value of that mitigation project might drop off over the years after the investment. So the goal is to maintain that investment at least for the project's useful life, which an engineer would usually be the one able to determine that. So I will also go back and say that your narrative section is a really important area to talk about, what's at stake here. There's definitely a lot of need in this state. I've been talking with my team to communities all over the state, and there's different needs for sure, but there's a lot of need and not enough money to do it all, right? So help us to understand why your project is viable and what's at stake. And sometimes the narrative really helps to elevate something that may not be as clear on its surface value. So paint the picture of the consequences of not doing the action as well as what will happen because of it. As much as possible, providing photos, maps, engineering studies to really clarify and help us paint the picture to understand your situation in your area and the hazards you're facing is really valuable to that as well. Let me go on to the next slide. Great. So an important category within your application is your project alternatives. This is where FEMA and the state are asking, okay, so if you didn't do this project this way, what other ways could you address the problem and have you thought them through? And so this is useful for the review teams to be able to say, well, interesting that you're not choosing to go this route per se. maybe maybe we want to explore that alternative as another option, because maybe your gut instinct isn't the best option or the most cost effective or the most beneficial, and so it might lead to additional discussions. But it's helpful for us to understand, well, what if you didn't do this, right? Would you have a temporary solution? What are you doing right now, for example, and just paint that picture. And then we'll evaluate kind of these alongside your actual project application, and maybe it will lead to a more robust future option instead. So it's a great chance to kind of do a little bit of alternatives analysis and help explain that to us of why you chose the route you did. Next slide. All right, so we're moving on to a fairly new portion of the application for FEMA. It's a high priority area, kind of working with the Social Vulnerability Index from the CDC that has data from back to 2018 that is used to kind of help us to know, are we helping the communities that need the most help or not? Next slide. All right, so essentially in the application, there's an area that talks about social vulnerability benefits. And this is, as I shared, something that CDC put out to help guide and identify where the most need is. And it's not always one thing or the other. There might be more than one category that identifies the need, but they did a pretty thorough analysis based on 2018. And there's a great map that's interactive that can give you a lot of great details about your community and your census tract. Ultimately, this came out because of Justice 40, which is a federal initiative to ensure that 40% or more of the funds are going to communities that are considered socially vulnerable. So when you're in this, what you'll fill out is explain which census tract or tracts. There might be more than one. Let's say you have a service area over a whole county. There's going to be multiple census tracts. Is the project that you're working on or benefiting located in? Please provide all of them that are relevant. And then what you're going to see is there's a category of, or the range is 0 to 1, 0 being not vulnerable and 1 being extremely vulnerable. What we're looking for ideally is scores that are 0.5 or higher for the area you're working in. And if you're looking at multiple census tracts, you probably have to do an average there to determine this. If you're looking at the county level, then it's really easy to click on the county and it will show you that whole broad information. But then if it's really more about one census tract or one part of the community, then you have to zoom in all the way to that census tract and click on it, and then it will tell you your overall score. If it's not a 0.5 or higher, it doesn't mean that you can't apply. Let's go to the next stage. The next stage being there's 4 theme rankings, so there's kind of 4 bars that exist there. And I think I might have, can we go to the next slide to verify? I might have more information on that. Would you mind? Great. So we're kind of talking, I'm already getting ahead of myself here. I apologize. So that's Albany County as the example. It has a score of 0.3 there out of a score of 1. So it doesn't qualify under the first category, but let's go to the next slide after that. Great. So, but in Albany, I think, and if you've been on a prior webinar, this might look familiar, but in Albany, there are 2 themes that are above that 0.5 mark. And so what you would indicate is that, yes, this does hit the theme ranking, being 0.5, and each of those themes have a particular category that they fit into. One of them might be related to, the number of minorities in the community where language is a gap or a challenge potentially. Another might be the housing or mobility. There's also, I think, also access to like food and other amenities is also in there. So, but there's a lot more information. We can definitely send things out to people. But ultimately, for your application, if you get to this point and you see that you have one or more of these themes that are those 4 bars above 0.5, then you would check yes. There's another category below that talks about economically disadvantaged rural communities, and that's I believe it's a category defined by the federal government, and I don't think it's necessarily going to be defined here in the CDC that way. So we can always review that with communities if they feel like that they qualify for that, and make sure that they kind of hit all the marks they need to check yes there. If after reviewing these 3 spots, you have a no at all of them, it doesn't mean that you can't apply, but we do ask that you explain to us maybe something we would not be able to quickly pick up at the census tract level. Maybe you're helping a particular community that is socially vulnerable or is maybe in a very vulnerable situation. Let's say, for example, there's a bridge that goes out. Without that bridge, if we don't address it, this community is really cut off from being able to exit or get out from a disaster, for example. That might be something worth highlighting here. Or if it's maybe there's a nursing home that's in a community and it's maybe it's a vulnerable or critical facility with some vulnerabilities, that might be worth acknowledging as well. So you can do some narrative here to explain some of the things you're addressing. Persuade us, help us to understand what's at stake, even if the numbers don't always quickly identify them for us. Next slide. All right, I think that's what we just sort of described, but you can also please show us, the maps and the images of where you're getting your data from. For example, you might also have, in addition to what I shared earlier, you might also have a school or a shelter that's being benefited by the project you're doing. Also, roads for emergency services being closed if this isn't done. For example, let's say a culvert needs to be upsized, and until it is, you're not able to have your fire department or your police be able to travel that route. They have to go a longer distance to help somebody or to do their services. This is where you would describe some of those things that aren't just community-wide or census-based, but what you're helping address and make more resilient. Next slide. All right, we got 2 more parts here. We're on part 5. This is more about showing in your maps, like showing us with maps where your community is located and what the project area is. So next slide, please. All right, so in every application, you will have to tell us where the work is that's happening. And there's been questions that have come up where, hey, I'm helping 15 homes with an elevation. Where should I put my latitude and longitude? If they're in a concentrated area, I think it's appropriate to put maybe a center point, if you will, for this, to show us generally where you're working out of. If they are kind of all over the place, it might be helpful actually to show us a couple different maps to demonstrate the areas that you're working within. And then also provide some description there up above. So providing a map itself, the actual latitude, longitude, as well as a description of the area. Like I said, if you need to, feel free to copy and paste this section and write in a couple of them if that's going to help you paint the picture. Next slide. Next slide when you get the chance, Felicia. Cool. Another important part of every application is to show us where this is located within the floodplain. As you probably are aware, FEMA is heavily focused on the National Flood Insurance Program as well as kind of flood management as a priority area. It's the #1 hazard, I believe, in the country. And so what we want to know is, where is this located as far as, that if you're working on a building, can you show us it within the floodplain? And, are you addressing that flood risk? Are you thinking about it? Let's say you have a generator project. Is that generator going to be, for a pump station, is the generator going to be elevated above the base flood elevation? We want to make sure we see those details in there if you're looking at the floodplain. So also, if you have a community or let's say a building for a home or a series of homes that need to be elevated, it would be great to see them in here with the flood map showing, yes, they are in the floodplain. If they aren't, we obviously could have discussions to verify and see what the issues are that you're facing. But generally speaking, we're looking to verify, yes, this information is verified within the flood insurance rate map. Next page. Great. So I was just describing kind of the flood map. And so there's this tool within FEMA's Flood Map Service Center that's kind of shown there as the example. So you would type in the address of where you're talking about, and then you can click on the dynamic map, and it will show you kind of if you're in a floodplain or not. And it also shows you on the right kind of a legend there to explain and describe the types of information you might be seeing on this, like on the map that's shown right there. I don't necessarily see a flood area in the way it's shown. So let's go to the next slide. I think there's more detail there to be seen. You click on the dynamic map, and then you can also download the map image. Next slide, please. Cool. So this is an actual, firm or ferment map, depending on kind of when it was made, I believe. And so this shows the information about kind of the community and the flood hazard areas. Ideally, we want to see where is the project in relation to the flood hazards that exist. So if you type in an address, we want to make sure we see that point called out clearly and can understand what the risks are to that particular project or that project area. Next slide. All right, so this is another mapping request to kind of help us to understand a detailed description of the proposed project benefit impact area. I think we have some maps here on the right that show the CDC information. And then on the left, we have information about kind of the waterways, the highways around it, that type of thing. So helping us paint the picture and understand where it is that you're serving or what the mitigation is actually addressing and kind of the area of mitigation that's occurring. Next slide. All right, we're into part 6, the final part before we have some Q&A at the end. This is about the timeline and schedule. I mentioned it earlier, but we'll go through a couple more details on it here now. Go ahead, go to the next slide, please. All right, so when you get into your application, there's a section below the scope and below what we just kind of covered about the timeline and schedule. This can be a bit of a confusing area from conversations I've had with people as well as what they've submitted so far. So I just want to call out a couple things to be aware of. It's always important to start at month 0. And the period of performance generally for this is 36 months. Doesn't mean you have to use all 36 months, and you could propose a schedule that's faster than that, for example, not a problem. But we're looking to verify that kind of all the steps are here, and you kind of called out how they are interchangeable and how long you anticipate that they'll take, as well as when they'll start. So if something's happening in parallel, then they're, for example, in this category, there's item 2, 3, and 4 are all happening at the same time and have different lengths. So you want to call that out to say, and that will help us kind of, if you will, have sort of a Gantt chart in our minds to be able to evaluate how the sequences fit together. At the end of it, you'll see at the bottom kind of a total duration of how long the project will take from beginning to end. So you'll put your estimate there based on kind of adding up this duration in months for the project's elements and how long they'll take. And then you'll put a proposed start date and end date. So right now, no one knows exactly when the start date will be for this project. You're welcome to put a number in there for the start date of what you'd like to see, but as I suggested earlier, really we don't know. It's probably going to be about spring of 2023. So in the example here, it's actually probably too fast. I would assume more of March, April, May, and just put your best guess in there, and ultimately that will just give us another data point to verify the consistency across these 3 data areas, which is the total duration, the kind of breakdown by months or weeks. You can do that if you want to change it to weeks as long as you're consistent, as well as the start and end dates, and have all those things aligned. Yeah, next page.
Ryan, this is Marlene. I just wanted to jump in there too and just
Please
reiterate that the 4615 and the 4625 approvals could be a little bit sooner than spring. And also,
perfect. Thank you.
Should you have a really large project, especially they tend to go out further when you do the phase 1, phase 2 projects. Just because this time FEMA will establish the period of performance at the first approval under that grant, and it's a 36-month window. So if you have a project that ends up being, for example, 4 years from beginning to end, please make sure that when you're doing your timeline, that you note that in there. Even though FEMA will only approve up to 3 years, we know that there will be a time extension required in order to complete that 4-year project. So make sure you also are giving yourself enough time. Think about if there's any restrictions, if you're certain times of the year, if you're going to be working in streams. Also, keep in mind weather. You have rain events and our winters here. So make sure that you allow yourself enough time in your timelines. Thanks.
Thank you, Marlene. Very helpful. And I'm primarily work on the 4480, so it's always good to have like a second perspective on that. So a couple of points to reiterate here. The timeline might be a little faster for awards for 4625 and 4615. If you had a project that was phased, for example, and you knew it was going to be longer than 3 years, doesn't mean that you can't apply for it. But you want to acknowledge the difference between phase 1 and phase 2. So those are both really helpful. Thank you, Marlene, for sharing that with everyone. Okay, and just by the way, this example that's shown is for a plan update. So it might look a little different if you're doing, a stream restoration project. Feel free to use our team to vet, how best to break this down. If you have questions, we're happily do that. All right, next slide. Great. So an important part of the application, there's actually 2 areas that cover the budget. One is this worksheet that's shown on the right, and I know it's a little hard to see. Apologize for that. There's a lot of details there, and this is just so everyone's aware. This is the example. It shows 75-25. Some of these are no longer that, and hopefully all of them will be moving to 90-10 soon. But in the meantime, this is just the example that we have for awareness. The important thing here is to really kind of break down the specifics by, personnel, fringe, supplies, contractors, etc. Help us to know what part of that is federal and what part of that is the local share. And then discuss about, which resources are, what sources are providing that income. So that's going to be the next slide, I believe. But on the left side, in the actual written application, so the one on the right is an Excel document that you'll fill out. The one on the left is in the written application. You'll kind of take the details and the summary from this detailed budget on the right, and you'll summarize them here on the left. A couple of things I've seen come through for kind of draft applications, maybe some confusion, is that management costs are kind of called out on the draft application as 100% federal share. The rest of the costs will be the federal, non-federal share split that's defined by the NOFO. So right now, again, 90-10 for the 4615, 4625, and 75-25 for 4480. You'll want to add the number, the value, not just the percentage there. You'll want to actually say, let's say you have a $100,000 project and it's 75-25. Please write down 75,000 and 25,000 for your federal and your non-federal share with the total cost, and then sum those up at the bottom. So if you have questions on this, our team is definitely available to help, but you'll sort of take this information on the right and then add it and synthesize it down on the left. Okay, next slide. Great, so we talked about this earlier, and I want to just call out that this is sort of the cost share example for the 90-10. So this doesn't yet apply for 4480, but we're assuming we'll get there. And so basically what I just wanted to call out is that, the federal share moving to 90% is a reimbursable grant and a not to exceed award. So that's an important thing to know for kind of cost planning and having enough budget to manage while you wait for funds to be reimbursed. With making up that 10% or that local cost share, a non-federal part, you can do it with in-kind services or materials. You can also do it from, like a donation from a third party, for example. So there are creative ways to make up that 10%, but it does not have to be hard cash. But it can be. But just know that when you're kind of thinking about it, if the local standard is a challenge, so maybe think about creative ways. Is there something you can do in-house? Are there things that people might be able to donate to from other entities because they think it's important to do this work? So those are things to think about. Okay, moving on to allowable costs. Sure. There's the pre-award and there. Oh, over. Can we go back? I think you might have gotten ahead of me. Alicia, can you go back another one? I think this is the slide I want to be on. So let's go back to 45 if you don't mind. All right. Oh. Okay, let's stay here at 44. Thanks. So on the application slide, there's a written description, kind of a summary, if you will, of the cost share. So we have had some questions come through about this. For that upper left area, it says total budget. That is your project cost, and it's, as I understand it, it does not include your management costs with it. So you'll kind of summarize your federal share and your proposed non-federal share, and you'll give a percentage on the side. It is possible, theoretically, to have a percentage other than the 90-10 or 75-25, but we can provide more guidance on that if that is your situation. Down below it, then you'll talk about kind of how you're providing the local or the non-federal funding source, talking about where your source is, the amounts, the types of things that are going into that, if it's in kind, for example, and any additional comments to help us explain or define and understand. We do need to see a fund commitment letter come with your application. That's an important component, is to say, well, how are you going to fund this, and is there a commitment to do so? That will be important to have at the time of award, and we definitely want to see that during the sub-application process. All right, next slide. Allowable costs. So there are pre-award costs as an option. I mentioned it earlier, and there's management costs. So we'll talk about both of those. Pre-award costs are things that are eligible for reimbursement if you're awarded for things you're doing to develop sub-application. And these have to be incurred after the start of kind of the declaration has happened. For the 4480, I think that was in like September of 2020, if I remember correctly. So it is possible to capture costs that you've worked on to get these applications together, to do necessarily like maybe engineering or planning efforts, for example. And these costs can also be incurred. You can kind of estimate what you might need to during the request for information process or the RFI process, which is going to happen after you submit your sub-application. This might help communities that are, needing to move forward on things, or just kind of capture your costs to help recover a little bit from the actual investment of trying to apply for the grant. For some projects, it's not insignificant. So this is a great way to maybe help cover those costs if you're awarded. You're not guaranteed to be awarded them, but you can submit them as a part of your total package. Management costs, again, are those things on top of your project costs that are for grant management purposes. It's the things that you wouldn't do if you didn't have a grant. Let's say you're funded from your typical sources. Let's say you're a community and you're from your tax base, you don't have to do all these additional reporting per se or accounting for the grant. So these are the things that are on top of your what you would normally do if you reduce this project another way. You can be up to 5% of your total project cost. So if you have a $100,000 project, you could have up to 5% or 5,000 that on top of that you could be awarded for management costs. So next slide.
Yeah, and just to reiterate there, this is Marlene.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That make sure that when you are figuring out management costs are at 100%. And like Brian said, that's up to 5% of the total cost of your project, not just the federal share, but the total cost. But if you're going to be using pre-award costs, that is also part of the 5%. So there can't be more than a total of the 5%. And those pre-award costs will be based on reimbursement of the federal share. So just please keep that in mind when you are looking at your budgets.
Thank you, Marlene. So yes, you could have management costs right now that you're incurring, as well as management costs during the project, but you only get a 5% total regardless if they're pre or post award. Thanks for clarifying that. This last one is, we have a whole webinar on it on Thursday. So if you have not been to one of our prior ones, we encourage you to come. You're also welcome to come just for another round of it. This again is one of the more complex aspects of any application. There's a section on it making sure that you have completed this and submitted this with your application. Without it, we are not able to approve projects and move them forward. So please take the time to download it, get familiar with it, utilize our team as a resource if you have questions along the way. And I encourage you to get started on this early because this often is the critical path for success in the application process, in my experience. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so we are at the end as far as content, and this is only an hour long. However, our team is happy to stick around for questions, and I know that there's been a number of them through the chat that I think Todd is managing. I appreciate that. This is a time when we can actually do some back and forth discussion, or that if you want to unmute, you're also welcome to address any verbally that you haven't gotten to. See here. Let me see if I can request you to unmute. See where things are at, what you'd recommend. And I understand people have to go. So I see a question that just came in, and I'll go ahead and answer it verbally. What is the timeline for these grants? The grants are due on June 1st, for the application is due. And I'm not sure if that's your full question or not, but and Thad, are you unmuted yet? Just want to make sure. All right. I guess if someone would like to raise their hand to ask any questions, you could do that now, or you could set something in the chat to say, I have a question. We can unmute you if you'd like to have some dialogue here. I think Thad is working vigorously on the chat. Hey, Thad, looks like you're unmuted now.
Yeah, I'm caught up. Let's see, where are we? Pre-award sub-costs, like pre-award costs like sub-application development can be in the project budget, or is it pre-award management costs? Can you confirm that this is okay with? Yes, pre-award costs, pre-award management costs are okay with dishes. They need to be reflected in the budget. What is the timeline for these grants? Again, Brian has sort of iterated that these likely we'll start to get answers beginning, first part of next year from FEMA, and through the spring and summer of next year. When will decisions, award of funds? Again, that's but they go to FEMA. FEMA will review the applications, may issue additional RFIs. They'll start to make decisions beginning early next year. Let's see, from Joy K, I was a little unclear. Was the management costs on top of the pre-award, or is it an either or? No, management costs and pre-award are both eligible, and there's also pre-award management costs that are eligible. So again, it's in HMA guidance. It's it's actually not that. The application budget has a space for it right on there. You fill it in. You're going to fill in your 5% management costs that you're claiming, and broken down as pre-award and award, post-award, and then any pre-award costs have to be broken down as a separate line item on the application.
Right.
Just 1 second, really quick
Wow.
here to go ahead, Marlene.
I'm sorry, that can only be total up to 5% together of
Right.
total project cost.
That's correct. Thank you, Marlene. Right. It's not 5% and then 5% again. The total is 5%, regardless of which portion is pre-award. What is let's see, can you show the slide again with the table of the various opportunities, their due dates and match requirements? Yes, Alicia could throw that up.
Yeah, Alicia, could you go to slide 5 or 6, I think, one of those two.
What is a 5% initiative project? Again, we can send the link to the guidance, but this is basically FEMA sets aside up to 5% of the award for projects that are sort of outside the box that can't make a traditional benefit cost analysis for whatever reason, or education and outreach. I mean, it's a subcategory of projects that kind of fall outside of the norm. Is there someone specific to contact to discuss if we have questions on the so you would just email us at that hmgp 4480 at dishes.ny.gov. It's we'll be sending it out. In fact, you'll get an email.
I just sent it out
from
to
us.
everyone too.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
And you'll be getting an email from that address in the near future as well. So you would reach out to us there, and then we'll assign you to the correct outreach specialist.
Great. And just a quick request again for Alicia, if you can hear me, if you wouldn't mind going back to slide 5 or 6, where we have kind of that summary of the different funding opportunities. Thank you. So we answered John. I think Amelia said another question there too. So
yeah, sorry to clarify. Does DISHES have a preference if sub-application development is in the project budget as a pre-award cost, or as a pre-award management cost? Okay, so sub-application development would be a pre-award management cost. Developing the actual application itself.
All right. Any other questions? We could certainly unmute people if anyone wanted to have a chat. I'm happy to linger a little bit longer and unmute you.
I think Deb has her hand up.
Deb? Okay, cool. Thanks. I will request you to unmute, and Deb, I think you have to accept something on your side, and then you should be able to ask a question.
Do the generators fall within the 4480?
Yeah, so you can use 4480 for the generators. Actually, all 3 of them. If you're in declared county on Friday, you'll be able to use it there too. But all of them, generators are a good project within all of them.
So it would be 4615 or 4480. It doesn't really matter.
Right. Unless you're also in a Fred county, which is one of the declared ones that are listed. Then yes, both of those would be places to submit. And we encourage people to submit for actually as many as you're eligible for to increase your chances.
That just means the difference between 9010 and 7525, right?
As of right now, yes, but most likely what we're anticipating by June 1st, when the actual deadline happens, we'll have had another update to the NOFO. So yes.
So when I'm preparing it, I probably should go 7525, not 9010, and on it.
I would say until it's officially updated, yes, but we do anticipate that we'll be moving into the 9010 for all 3 of these funding sources, just working out all the paperwork and negotiations accordingly. So, but yeah, you can kind of have in the back of your mind that most likely that option will be available.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions there, Deb? Okay, so it looks like you're off. Joy, I see your hand is also raised. I'm going to request you to unmute. You're welcome to confirm and ask a question. Or did you see that request come through? I think I sent you one, so. While we're waiting for Joy, there was a question from our Hauser. If we're applying for 4 generators for 4 group homes, do we need to submit 4 separate applications or 1 with specifics on each location? That's a good question. You are able to, for the same type of activity, so if you're doing generators, for example, you could put those all in 1 application as long as it's sort of the same, jurisdiction or area, if you will. But you would want to explain the location of each of them, as well as you'd have to do a separate benefit cost analysis for each location. And then they'd have to aggregate to a cost-effective project and investment. And it looks like Joy has a question she wrote there. It looks like the BCA isn't working well in your Excel. I would encourage you, Joy, to reach out to that email. I think I've sent it. I'll just repost again right here. We've been dealing with that a lot, so we have some prefabricated materials we can send your way to give you some suggestions. Without knowing your situation, it probably would be better to kind of take that offline if that's all right. Yeah. I don't see any other hands raised right now. Anybody else? Looks like Ben Murphy wrote in, would related projects across multiple jurisdictions require separate applications? Great question. So I think the best example might be, depends on who you're working for, Ben. Not familiar with your situation per se, but if you had, again, maybe 4 generators or 4 culverts that you're upsizing, the same type of activity can be in 1 application, but essentially, if it becomes a thing where there's separate issues that you're addressing with different types of activities, it really doesn't fit under one application. So it might get pretty confusing if they're combined, unless they're really the same type of issue repeated with very similar projects. So that answers your question. And we could definitely like suss that out in more detail if you wanted to reach out to us. We'd be happy to set up a call and hear more about your projects. That sounds worthwhile. Good. Anybody else? I don't see any other questions coming in, but take an extra minute too, or if you need to type something out, or you can raise your hand if you want to chat. We'd be happy to talk about this and help people be successful as possible in this process. Thank you all for sticking around and for being a part of this. This is, as I understand it, the biggest funding pot from this funding source since Sandy. So lots of money here on the table. We want to make sure all of it comes back to New York State. Sharon Lilla wrote, under sub-applicant information, there is a question about the EO12372. How do we know if our project is subject to that? I'm not super familiar with that one. I think Thad might be, or Marlene. Would either of you be willing to answer that question? Let's see. Hopefully they're unmuted right now. I'm going to double check, make sure. It looks like Thad pulled himself off, so I'm going to invite him to come back in. And Thad, if you or Marlene want to answer that, you can always research and get back to you. Yeah. That might be a good one for us to follow up with you, Sharon. If we're not able to get you a quick answer, I apologize. I'm kind of pinch hitting today, so I'm not super familiar with that one. I apologize.
Yeah, that one we would have to know more detail.
Yeah. So why don't you, Sharon, if you don't mind writing just a quick chat over to the dishes, and we can make sure we get your resources on that and see how we can help you out, okay? Any other questions or folks that want to engage? We're here and would love to chat. Okay, just maybe 30 more seconds just in case.
I just pasted the what the executive order means. I don't know if that will be helpful, but
Oh, thank you. Yeah. That's one I think we probably need to hopefully give you more detail or review it, your situation in more detail together to see how it might apply or not. So thank you for asking that. It's a new one for me. So okay. Well, not seeing anything else coming in. I think we'll call it a wrap. I appreciate again everyone coming today. I hope this was helpful. And please reach out to that email that I've kind of posted, or that's posted a few times with project ideas, with other questions that come up to you afterwards. Yeah, good luck with our hazard mitigation. We're looking forward to working with you and seeing a lot of applications come through. Have a great day and take care. And Alicia, you can start recording.